Hot on the heels of the Final Fantasy VII Remake, Square Enix has released a more modest remake of the third game in the Mana series, Trials of Mana. Does it manage to improve upon the original? Hey everybody, welcome to another one of our unscripted episodes. Previously we had called these MLIG Minis, but we've decided to change course and rebrand them as MLIG Adlib.
Yeah, they weren't exactly mini, were they? The Final Fantasy VII one ended up being an hour long, and I was kind of saying like, oh, it's almost like a joke now that these are like, 20-some minutes long now, 60-some minutes long. And I kind of like that, but I think you raised a lot of good points of, let's change the name. So MLIG Adlib, it's fun to say, it's accurate to what we're doing. And again, this does not replace scripted content by any means. It's just a way for us to make some videos about stuff we feel like doing in a way that doesn't take away our production time from other episodes. Today, we're talking about Trials of Mana, the remake specifically of Trials of Mana, which is a game that was kind of a thing that was really sought after here in the West for a long time. People called it way back in the day, I think in large part because we didn't get it. The best Super Nintendo game that we never got, or maybe even the best RPG on the system. And so we're kind of going to break that down a bit and take a look at what really is the original and how the remake comes into play there.
Secret of Mana was well loved when it was released in 1993, almost worldwide. And, I played it when it came out because a friend bought it, who was a big fan of Zelda. He was not a big RPG fan, but this seemed more up his alley.
Yeah, I didn't play it until much later. It was into like the N64 PlayStation generation. And I definitely got the sense that this had become one of the most beloved action RPGs that had ever been made. And it's a game that took a long time to grow on me, to be honest. I really enjoyed the multiplayer aspect of it, but the mechanics and stuff never totally felt as solid as something like Zelda, which isn't really an RPG to begin with. But this really does blend those RPG elements with the action. And Secret of Mana is kind of held in such a high regard that it feels like the series has had a hard time living up to the standard that it set and the expectations that it set for what the series is. And I found myself personally kind of drawn to many games in the Mana series, and I don't think Secret of Mana is like the one infallible entry in the series, but I will say over the years come to a much greater appreciation for Secret of Mana, or Seiken Densetsu 2, since it is of course not the first in the series.
Trials of Mana, as it's called in Japan, is Seiken Densetsu 3. What's interesting about it is the fact that it was one of the earliest high-profile fan translations to be released. It, along with Final Fantasy V, were the first two fan translations that I checked out in the late 90s, and it's kind of unbelievable that it took as long as it did for it to arrive in the US. It took almost 25 years from the time it was released to us finally getting it here in the US as part of Collection of Mana on the Nintendo Switch.
Yeah, which, it seemed like for a long time we weren't even going to get that. And of course, there's always the stuff that people say like, oh, the fan translation exists. They should just use it. And of course, that doesn't seem to really happen. But there is a official translation of the game now. And it is kind of fun that people ended up dumping it, and now you can apply that patch and play the official translation on real hardware. But I did personally play all the way through the fan translation. It's actually, to be honest, I think one of, as much as I love fan translations, I think it's only one of two fan translations that I put the time in to play all the way to the end. The other one was Sweet Home on the Famicom. And we had a good time. It was during a marathon, so I have to be honest, the context of streaming and everything that was going on, the game didn't totally coalesce in my memory. There's a very fleeting images of that experience in my head.
One of the things that immediately turned me off was the fact that battle is a separate thing compared to Secret of Mana. Secret of Mana, you move through the world and you attack, and you never have to go into a separate mode to fight. With Trials of Mana, everything stops and the screen recenters on everybody, and then everybody pulls out their weapons and then you fight. And then, you get experience, then you move on. And that, I felt, really destroyed the overall flow of the action for me.
It almost just feels like an RPG where you happen to be able to move about, because it feels like the hitboxes and the timing and stuff is pretty broad and generous. So it just sort of feels like you're issuing commands, waiting for your weapon to do its little flash so it can be used again. Build up your special attack meter, cast spells and stuff. A lot of undodgeable stuff, more undodgeable stuff than Secret of Mana. So I think people looking for that action RPG aspect from the original Super Famicom Trials of Mana or Seiken Densetsu 3 might be a little disappointed by that, but if you can get your head in this mindset of this is just an RPG where I can move around and battle, I think that's the mindset you have to take into it.
Upon revisiting it, I was really taken with just how clunky it was in a lot of aspects. The menus are so slow that they are annoying to use anytime you have to. In Secret of Mana, you could do everything through the ring menu, but here you got to go to a separate screen, and all the different options available to you take forever to scroll to it, and it made it extremely annoying most of the time.
Yeah, the menus just feel like they're glitching out or something. Like it feels like something is broken. Like I literally thought, like is like the translation patch like causing some sort of issue? But no, it just is that way. It's designed a way that I don't think the Super Famicom is really meant to work. The menus had a lot of headroom for improvement. I'll say that.
All this stuff just seems like, to me, really felt like a huge downgrade from Secret of Mana, which a lot of people will rag on that game because of the bad AI getting stuck behind stuff, which is not a problem in 3 at all. That was obviously one of the things that they took the time to address. From my point of view, I really felt like it was a pretty steep downgrade. Not even just in gameplay, but story as well.
I feel like, especially now that maybe it's not this super special thing that we didn't get, I think people have maybe cooled on Seiken Densetsu 3 a little bit, compared to, it was this like, oh, we didn't get it, so people were calling it, the best RPG and we didn't get it. I don't think that's really the prevailing opinion anymore, but I do think it is good, but it does have its flaws, and certainly a remake had a lot of room to improve on that.
The first one had a HD remake, Adventures of Mana, which came out, I think it's just on the Vita and PC right now. That was remade earlier as Sword of Mana.
Correct, on the Game Boy Advance, which is not a terribly popular game, but I think you could say that of almost any Mana game that's not Secret of Mana.
Adventures of Mana and the Secret of Mana remake that came out in 2017, it came under a lot of fire, especially the latter.
Because it's so beloved.
It was so beloved, but in the remake really didn't do a whole lot that felt aesthetically right. People would say that it looked it looks generic, It really does. It almost looks like, in a lot of ways, it looks like an up-res mobile game.
I was not personally as offended by the remake of Secret of Mana as a lot of people were. I didn't play all the way through it. I know that you did. I did think the music was kind of bad though.
Secret of Mana on the Super NES did have its fair share of bad instrumentation.
Yes, but it was overall pretty faithful in terms of the world layout and stuff. I mean, it even used like the original pixel graphics shrunken way down as like your little mini map. So I mean, it was very faithful to how the original played out, but it was aesthetically perceived as being very cheap and very low budget, which, I mean, I'm sure they worked with what they had, I guess.
It was a great way to revisit the game with some modern conveniences in some aspects. Like you said, the music was very much a mixed bag. I mean, I have no idea what kind of budget they had behind it. I'm surprised that they didn't do more with it, but I played through the whole thing. I liked it.
There!
When the remake of Trials of Mana was announced alongside the localization of Collection of Mana at E3 2019, it really took everything to the next level. It's obvious that they took that response to Secret to heart.
Camera is behind the character now, so it's much more of like a Zelda-like perspective or something like that, rather than it's overhead like it used to be, but in polygons. No, this is pretty different. It is closer and more faithful to the original than, say, Final Fantasy VII Remake, but it is also much more radically reimagined than the Secret of Mana remake.
It is completely different, but it sticks really close to the original game's overall plot progression.
Yeah, I mean, that is true. I mean, the story, I gotta say, is really ambitious. You choose a class from 6 different characters, and these are all characters with defined personalities, backstories, motivations, and goals. And you choose who's the main character and who are the supporting members. And depending on who you choose, the dialogue plays out differently. Different villains rise to power. The final boss is different depending on who you have chosen as your main character. So it's really ambitious, and I think because of all those different pieces that they have to make align, the overall structure of the game is pretty basic. It's not that exciting of a story, but I do think as an RPG that puts the player in control of how the story unfolds, it's actually pretty cool.
While ambitious, the problem is, for me at least, is that it does not play out in this grand scale that it seemed to in Secret of Mana. To the game's benefit, they did add a extra post-game chapter, which is all new for this, and it has more of a proper last boss, but it doesn't really fit into the narrative of everything that came before. It's kind of a side story that takes place before the end of the game.
Even though the overall plotting of the game is not that great in terms of like what's our motivation for going here, and there. Like it's very scattershot in that regard. But the game is always pushing you in new directions. You're not going to get bored of an area because you've been there too long.
It does stay really, really close to the original plot. Even comparing it to the official translation on Collection of Mana, I was kind of surprised that there are like line for line pieces of dialogue that are exactly the same, like entire segments.
Yeah.
It is extremely close, probably to a fault in a way.
I would agree it's to a fault because the voice acting is atrocious.
It's me, Matelo, the supernatural enthusiast. I have fulfilled a dream of mine. I'm a ghost. But now that I've tried it out, I think I'll go home.
I honestly think that maybe part of the reason it's so bad is because that, even though the translation, the English translation is new, the original game was written for Super Famicom. It was written for a simpler time. It was written to be read. And there are instances I can think of, like the Monkey Island remakes, where dialogue that was written to just be read in the original somehow magically just sounds brilliant when spoken. But that is not the case here. I feel like I could have taken this game more seriously if I was reading the story rather than listening to the story. And I did try switching it to Japanese early on, but what I didn't like about that was you might have read it and you're ready to advance it, so you push a button, but they actually weren't done speaking. So then you like skip all these animations and it's like a jump cut where all the characters have moved on ahead. So there's no way to, I just, why does every game need voice acting? What was so bad about the days when Zelda didn't have voice acting? I never understood this, this notion that like all games need voice acting or else it's lazy. I mean, this is a game that I think would have benefited from a more modest story presentation.
It is certainly an improvement on the Secret of Mana remake voiceover, if I have to say so myself.
One thing I will say though, I think one character that has gotten sort of the most flack for voice acting is Charlotte. She's a half elf, half human, which causes her to age very slowly. So she's 15 years old, but looks like she's like 4 or 5. And she has what a lot of people have kind of described as a baby talk. And if you look at the official Trials of Mana translation,
it's in there too. I was surprised.
She has that same, the L's and R's are replaced with W's. And I will admit it's very obnoxious to read, but I actually thought her voice was maybe one of the more consistent and less annoying voices in the game. I mean, I feel kind of alone in that, but I kind of thought of her like a female Homestar Runner. She has like a speech impediment, but it doesn't sound like baby talk. So I was not annoyed by her.
What's with this kid?
What's with you? Ow! 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 Let me go, you big old...
It really stands in stark contrast to Final Fantasy VII Remake, which released in the same month. I mean, that is like a huge, big budget, major production. This is very clearly of much more modest means, which is fine. I mean, I think, the Man series has kind of been mostly dead for a long time, and I can totally understand that they can't just pump a ton of money into it, but it is a noticeable upgrade over the Secret of Mana remake. The Unreal Engine looked like it was well suited to that game, and considering that it was targeting releasing on Switch as well as PS4 and PC, you could tell that it was targeting a lower level of graphical fidelity. And even when we played it on PS4 Pro, there are still a lot of technical issues, like a lot of geometry pop-in, a lot of low-res textures. The frame rate is high on PS4 Pro, but it by no means hits 60 frames consistently. It still looks reasonably good. Like, the art style of the Mana universe, I think, really meshed well with the Unreal Engine.
That's one thing that I've noticed about the implementation of the Unreal 4 engine into these types of games, because it was very similar to Dragon Quest XI. It's a very similar look.
It is, but Dragon Quest XI is clearly more polished. So I think the level of optimization per platform isn't quite up to the level of Dragon Quest XI, but it does have like a good look where the lighting feels very natural. And the character models are very detailed, but clearly the models also have limitations, because things like Duran's hair is just so over the top, like gigantic. And, as he turns around, he just has this huge mass of hair just flopping about as he turns. And he's got his sword, sheathed in his back, and it just clips through like crazy. And so even though the models are high quality, they clearly just didn't have the budget to account for little details like that. But it is a good looking game, and I think the art style is served well by it. Like, something I keep thinking is like, it feels like a Super Nintendo game come to life.
Yeah, it's because you compare it to Final Fantasy VII Remake, which is super, super detailed and gorgeous. But at the same time, there is definitely an appeal to these simpler graphics, and it doesn't need to be super flashy. It serves the same purpose, and there's something about that look that really resonates with me, that it feels that it's okay for it not to be, gonna win best graphics of the year or something like that. It's really solid feeling. It's
budget, but it's appealing at the same time.
Some of the animation on the characters can be a little bit silly at times. There is a late game animation of that I remember specifically laughing out loud, is when Duran is like pointing at a character, and it looks so like silly.
Oh yeah, what's funny is that's a canned animation that actually happens in the beginning too, when he's talking to the fortune teller, and like his voice actor sounds very flat, but he's all like flinging his fist like, I am gonna rip your head off.
Fortunes? Why would I trust my fate to something like that? All I believe in is strength. But I'll listen to what you have to say if you tell me how to become more powerful.
if I was to say one thing about the Trials of Mana remake, I do think, from my perspective, that it's probably the best action RPG core gameplay that has been in a Square Enix action RPG to date. It feels good to play. I think the combat, both of us will agree, is just an unquestionable upgrade over the original. Everything about swinging your weapons just feels good. It just feels fluid. When battle begins, your characters pull out their weapons. When battle ends, they sheath them, and there is no hiccup, no pause. You can keep moving. It displays the experience and items you got, any bonuses.
How I said earlier that the thing that really turned me off about the original is the fact that everything pauses, you pull out your weapons, and you go into battle. Here, it's the same thing, but it's hidden in such a way to make it seem like that doesn't even happen. And not only that, but you can assign the AI so that your characters are healing each other. I felt very, very safe letting them just kind of do their own thing, because they will heal me when I need it, or if I need to heal them, it's okay. And I just set them to go completely loose and not have to hold anything back.
Yeah, and there were times I played on hard mode, so there were definitely times where my HP got in danger, and I had Charlotte in my party, who's the main healer, and most of the time she did a good job of just, keeping us healed. But there were times where we were in emergency mode, and I would send her a manual command, which was very easy to do, to like, hey, let's heal, and as long as she wasn't like falling down or something, that would be a pretty quick response. I could be attacking an enemy over here, and then the AI would be working on an enemy behind me, and they would totally take him out. I feel like that didn't really happen in the Final Fantasy VII Remake so much, where it felt like the other party members were kind of just biding their time and acting like they were doing damage when really they weren't doing super significant damage. Like the character you are controlling is the one that is really making the difference in that game. In this game, I feel like, yeah, you're making slightly more difference than the AI controlled characters, but they're pulling their weight.
Each enemy, you might want to use different spells, and you have a variety of shortcuts that you can use. You can press one of your shoulder buttons, and it will bring up a menu, and you can hit triangle, square, cross, or circle to assign different items or magic to them. And it is really nice how convenient this is, because you can do it on the fly. You can even do it on a per battle basis if you want to.
I have to admit, I'm not too good at using quality of life conveniences like that in games a lot of the times. I do it the old clunky way and just bring up my ring menu every time. So I did not take great advantage of that, other than for the class strikes, which I don't even know if there's another way to use the class strikes, which is kind of like a limit break-ish skill that you charge up a meter, and depending on your class, you can unleash it at 100%, 200%, 300%, or 400%. So I used the shortcuts exclusively for class strikes. Items and spells I just did on a as needed basis.
There is one part that the game is extremely difficult. It's a crazy difficulty spike, and it's maybe not because the actual fight is hard, but it's because of the way that the AI doesn't really know how to deal with the enemy, and that is the wall boss in Laurent, which I've seen a lot of people talk about it, saying that it's by far the worst part of the game. And that's a part where I just died like a ridiculous amount of times before I was able to kind of cheese it and finally beat it. But I knew you had a similar experience.
Yeah, I mean, I don't remember if I totally wiped out on the fight. I actually don't think I did, but
Oh, I wiped out like 4 or 5 times.
Well, it was just obnoxious because I was just constantly having to use the Cup of Wishes to revive my allies, and they would just immediately die because, to be fair, it is difficult to dodge the spikes. I mean, it's just a badly designed fight, and I don't remember that fight very well in the original, so it might be just based on poor design to begin with. But one thing I will say that I really appreciated in general, that was a big part of why the battle system is just so fun, is that the enemies have these very clear markers on the ground that show where their attack is going to be, if it's going to radiate around them or if it's going to be in a straight line from them. And that made it just so clear and enjoyable to play through those fights. I don't know if it was maybe inspired a bit by Final Fantasy XIV. Final Fantasy XIV, especially boss fights, make heavy use of those sorts of tells where a part of the ground will show you, okay, you do not want to be standing here. And in this game, I just thought that was extremely well implemented and just further added to the enjoyment of those fights.
But I think we can both agree that if you spend a little bit of time, if you really go out of your way to fight all the enemies, then you're going to be over leveled very quick.
I don't even know if it's accurate to say that you're over leveled exactly. It's just that, I don't know. It just seems like the enemies are balanced to be really easy, but the RPG fundamentals of this game, I think, are really strong in the sense that you get a lot of customization over who is your party and how to build those characters. So you get these skill points that go into strength, stamina, spirit, intelligence, and luck, but the skills that each character gets, and then they unlock different skills as you class them up, and of course you choose branching paths for how they class up, so each playthrough might have different skills for them to learn. And I thought that part was just really compelling, learning the different skills of the characters.
It's very easy to use those skills and combine them, because some skills can only be applied to the one character and other skills can be applied to the entire party. It is very, very easy to break the game.
One that particularly surprised me, I had Duran in my party, and I thought his luck skills were really interesting. But he had lots of cool skills where, if you hit an enemy with a critical hit, you had a 20% chance of lowering their defense, and they would get a little defense down icon, which okay, critical hit, you think maybe that doesn't happen that often. 20%, that's not a huge amount, but it actually happens a lot. It makes a big difference on boss fights. And then later on in his luck skills, he learned abilities to increase, I think it was increase the likelihood of critical hits by 40%. So I was just getting critical hits and defense down all the time. And so I just thought that was really interesting. That was something that I didn't do in an RPG very often, focus on luck skills. So that was just kind of fresh and fun for me. And in general, I had a lot of fun building the characters.
I really like the level of customization that you could have in the options for this game. I went through a lot of the game, every time you use a class strike, it plays out this animation, which can get kind of old after a while, but you can actually go into the options and turn that off. And when you said that you turned it off, I was like, wait, you can do that? And there is a lot of different little tweaks to the options that you can do, such as that. In Final Fantasy VII Remake, I would have loved to turn off the summon intro.
Yeah, and speaking of just how much there was to do in the options menu, I think one of my favorite parts of the Trials of Mana remake is really just the user interface in general. It's very attractively designed. When you're outside of the menu and you've got your little HUD with the mini map and your characters with their HP, it's very easy to look at, easy to read. And then when you go into the menu, it's a very attractive, easy to navigate, easy to use menu. You can put skill points into your characters, you can equip them, and it looks good and it is responsive, very much unlike the original Super Famicom version. But one criticism that I know we both have about the menu system is that you have to go into the menu, into your items, and manually equip those to your traditional mana ring menu that you use outside of battle, which is really frustrating for certain items, especially you would get these tonics or whatever that would give you your permanent, stamina up or permanent HP up. You have to equip and you use them up. There's no reason to make that a quick select on your item menu, but you have to go in the menu, add it, go out of the menu, bring up the ring menu, and use them one at a time, or things like the items that summon your transportation allies and things like that. Those things do not need to be on the ring menu, but the game forces you to put them there, and I'm not really sure why that is.
When we talked about Final Fantasy VII Remake, one of your favorite parts about that was the fact that the way that, you know, you'd walk by people on the, like on the street and their dialogue would just play out whether or not you're interacting with them. That does not happen here. You can talk to all the different people in town, like one by one, and have traditional dialogue with them. But the game saves your time by showing you the people that you specifically have to talk to, or specifically, or places you specifically have to go to advance the plot. I mean, there's almost no reason to talk to anybody else in the town unless you might get some additional skills, but it really throws the idea of exploring the town out the window in terms of talking to people and feeling everything out.
I think I've mentioned maybe in the Final Fantasy VII discussion that talking to people in towns is kind of one of these tedious parts of RPGs that I don't always enjoy that much. But here I did think that I didn't get obsessive about it, but I basically talked to everyone at least once. And I didn't learn a lot of anything enlightening, but it was still pretty breezy to go around the town and do that stuff. It didn't really get on my nerves to do that, because I will admit in the original game, it sometimes it felt very arbitrary what would trigger the plot to advance, and you were just talking to NPCs not knowing when it would end. At least here it's like, okay, I feel like I've looked over this town pretty good. I feel done with it. I'm going to go talk to the person with a star over their head, you know? So it worked. It was a good bit of streamlining that I don't think, for me, didn't take away from the desire to explore.
It respects your time, which is one of my favorite things about modern RPGs, is when they respect your time like that. One of our least favorite aspects of modern gaming is present here, and that is the day-night cycle, which thankfully is almost completely worthless and unnecessary to even pay attention to.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are little things that matter, like, oh, you know, if it's Salamander Day, the enemies that cast fire magic or something, it might be a little stronger.
But did you ever plan out attacking certain bosses?
No.
Because of that, I mean, it almost doesn't need to be.
I didn't think about it all. I mean, it's, you know, day-night cycles can be cool, I guess, but it's just, they're so overdone. I'm so tired of them. I prefer mostly playing in the daylight in most games anyway, but it's not really in the way, and the nighttime in this game isn't really all that dark. It has a nice, appealing light to it.
But the transition when it goes from day to night, it's so janky looking.
It's very rough. Like, you see, like, the lighting, like, turn off and then turn back on, and it's not great. One of the jankier parts of the game, and you know, and to be fair, not to say that this game does not have its share of jank, because it is a bit of a budget game.
Honestly, I felt really compelled to do as much extra stuff as I could before I beat the game. Such as there's a whole scavenger hunt with this little guy, a little cactus, and I really went out of my way to find him, and I was able to find him in every single instance before I finished the game. And you know, he gives you a pretty good skill, which is very good for the post-game dungeon.
I think the game does a really good job of making you feel good about exploring and poking your head in every corner. They do a good job of hiding treasure chests and little sparkly spots on the ground and stuff like that, where, you know, even though the town designs look pretty simple on the surface, and they are slightly larger than they are in the Super Famicom original, they still manage to find like little hidden corners. It's like, oh, if I look just behind that building, you know, there's a a treasure chest or something like that, which if you compare that to the Super Famicom version, there's very little to discover outside of battle. Like, there's not much reason to look around at all. So I think even though the rewards in the treasure chests and stuff tend to be pretty small, like it's satisfying. They really nailed that feeling of satisfaction of like, oh, I found a little thing over here, you know, so.
I found the treasure chests and the little bits of money spread out around the ground to be kind of annoying after a while, because there's almost never anything worthwhile or any like worthwhile amounts of money or anything that's like that you couldn't just like buy at a shop for 20 gold. It's like saying like, please come pick me up, pick this up, it's right here. And it's like 3 lucre. Like, oh, I'm glad I really went out of my way and ran over there to do it. It's not even worth the time.
Yeah, but I mean, you were going to do it anyway. So I mean, I don't know. I get what you're saying, because I feel like I could be annoyed in another game by that. Like, oh, I'm just like so tired of looking around every corner. I just want to move on. I just want to progress. You know, I don't want to be distracted by going in all these different directions. But something about the way the little hidden things were handled in this game, like it wasn't really so much about the reward as it was just that a little bit of dopamine that's just like, oh, I found that chest.
After we both finished the post-game dungeon, you said, you know, I'm kind of looking at the trophy list. I'm kind of compelled to get the platinum trophy, which is not something that either of us have said in a long time. And I was like, yeah, me too. I don't feel like it'd be that hard to do. I
don't think I've gotten a platinum trophy since like either Gravity Rush on the Vita, or I think I did Infamous Second Son on the PS4. And like, I used to enjoy getting platinum trophies like on a game-by-game basis. Never really cared about the overarching trophy statistics. But you know, sometimes the game strikes you, it's like, yeah, I want to get the platinum trophy in that. And I don't know, something about this game, even though it would require at least 2 more playthroughs so that you could beat all of the possible final bosses.
But you get enough skills from the New Game Plus to be able to make those additional playthroughs go real quick if you wanted to, especially if you're going to skip a lot of the story.
Even if the story isn't that interesting in and of itself, like I just think it'd be fun to do. So maybe I will, maybe I won't. But you know what? Regardless, it's the first time in a long time that I was like, yeah, I want to do that.
Be careful. Something's coming. I cannot believe this is happening!
After the mixed reception to the music in the Secret of Mana remake, I think that the music here is very, very close to the source material, and I would be surprised if like longtime fans were disappointed in it.
Don't expect anything that's like going to knock your socks off in terms of like a grand reimagining of the originals, but they sound like a nice upgrade over the Super Nintendo sound chip. Although I will say there are certain tracks that I still think I feel like there was maybe more impact on the Super Nintendo, like, you know, the opening of the game that's been playing behind me this whole time. That is one of my absolute favorite sequences of anything on the Super Nintendo / Super Famicom. And I love the music, especially when it kicks in when you see the fairies flying across the clouds. That rendition of the main Mana theme is just one of my favorite things ever. And so it just didn't hit me in the same way in the remake. But otherwise, most of the other music just has a good, rich sound to it that, yeah, it's nothing crazy, nothing that deviates too strongly, but it's not going to offend anyone.
I think it's safe to say that we both ended up liking this a lot more than we expected to going in, which is kind of interesting coming off of Final Fantasy VII Remake, because this is a much lower budget game, but we seem to connect with it in a different way than we did with Final Fantasy VII.
Yeah, and I wouldn't say that by any means we don't think Final Fantasy VII Remake is a bad game, and it's certainly...
It was a nice breath of fresh air.
That's a good way to put it, because the Final Fantasy VII is more open to, I guess, a spirited discussion, perhaps. But this is just,
right.
It's pretty, it's good at doing what it does. It has its shortcomings and limitations, but it's just like, the core of it is just very enjoyable, and something about that simplicity, something about just that simpler visual style. Yeah, you're right. It's a breath of fresh air. It's just something that, I don't know, maybe us old fogies just get into a little bit easier. I don't know, but
if you're feeling overwhelmed by gameplay systems and big adventures and stuff these days, I think it's well worth checking out. I mean, it felt really good after how heavy Final Fantasy VII Remake was.
So yeah, I think it's safe to say that the Mana series has had a nice upward trajectory of its remakes thus far, and regardless whether they do something with this gameplay style again, or whether they refine the visual style for other Super Nintendo upgrades, I mean, I really want to see where this development team goes, and hope that we'll get more good work out of them in the future.